Hi there and welcome to this Gaming Memories video where I'm going to be looking at 10 Commodore 64 budget games that are blatant clones of other more famous games. Now when budget gaming first started on the Commodore 64, primarily with Mastertronic, a lot of the early games that they released were clones of arcade games like Pac-Man, Centipede, Carnival and others. However, I'm not going to be looking at games like that because they were released a number of years after the arcade games came out, so it didn't really seem so bad. What I'm going to be looking at is budget games that came out in the late 80s and early 90s, and these came out at roughly the same time as official conversions of arcade games came out, so they're effectively trying to cash in and steal their thunder to some extent. Now I'm rating these games on two levels, so first I'm going to rate them on how good a clone they are, that'll be a rating out of 5, and then also how good a game they are, again that'll be a rating over 5. And that's allowed me to sort them into an order, roughly into a top 10 from best to worst, although it is very interchangeable I have to say. So without further ado, let's take a look at these 10 budget clones from the Commodore 64 that are complete rip-offs, as I say, of other more famous games.
I'm going to begin with some games that clearly rip off the graphics from more well-known games, but the gameplay is quite different, and the first of those is Ed the Duck. You could argue that this is a little bit of a cheat, as it was originally published as a full-price game by Impulse in 1990, cashing in on the popularity of children's BBC's mascot. It was later re-released at budget price by Zeppelin Games though, which is what qualifies it for this list. If you were to look at screenshots of this game on the packaging and the first level in particular, this is very clearly influenced by Rainbow Islands. The look of that first stage is very similar to the classic Taito platformer, with several enemies seemingly pulled straight from that game. It also has the vertically scrolling play area where you begin at the bottom of the level and must make your way to the top. However, that's really where the similarities end, as this is a pretty basic collect 'em up where you must pick up a number of stars on each stage to complete it. These can be collected in any order, and if you miss one lower down, you can drop back down to collect it. The graphics are certainly vibrant, as you'd expect from a game that rips off Rainbow Islands, but most of the backgrounds and many of the enemies are single colour Spectrum style offerings, the exception being Ed, who is multicoloured and quite well designed. An amusing touch is that there's one enemy that is just a large disembodied hand, which is presumably a nod to the character's origins as a hand puppet. The game has decent presentation with a nice title screen that has a good SID tune, while the in-game sounds are reasonable if fairly sparse. There is a good variety of different enemies to avoid or shoot, and the scrolling is smooth. The gameplay is very samey and quite annoying though. Ed has a diagonal jump that can't be altered mid-air, and you also can't control your direction whilst falling. That makes getting around the level frustrating compared to the game that it's cloning, and there are too many upwards leaps of faith that often see you hitting enemies you don't know are there until the screen scrolls. After a few levels, the scenery changes to a more spacey style, and the comparison to Rainbow Islands effectively ends at that point. It seems like those early stages were probably done just to attract fans of the popular arcade game, but this game is nowhere near as fun. It would have been just about worth it as a budget title though, as there is a fair amount of game here at least. In 9th place I've gone with Prince Clumsy, which was released by Codemasters in 1990. Static screenshots of this game make it look like a blatant clone of the Capcom classic Ghosts and Goblins, with the main character, backgrounds, objects and some enemies closely resembling the run and gun game. However, if you bought the game and played it, you'd find it's flick screen rather than scrolling, and the gameplay has more in common with adventure platformers such as Codemasters' own Dizzy, as you have to find keys to unlock doors to progress, and can also pick up health boosts as well as weapons power-ups. It's more forgiving than Ghosts and Goblins, as your character has health rather than just the 2 hits that kill Arthur in the arcade game. It's not without its annoyances though, as every screen features respawning enemies that drain health and are quite hard to avoid. There are also instant kills on spikes and water pools that you sometimes can't predict you're going to fall into due to the game's flick screen nature, and that's not helped by the dodgy collision detection on the edges of platforms that can cause you to drop off before you expect to. This is one of those games where you'll make more progress the more times you play it, and it does seem to get easier after the first key is collected. The graphics are obviously derivative, but are actually pretty nice, and overall the game can be annoying, but it's not awful for a budget offering with some decent platforming action. These days it's probably one to play with an infinite lives cheat to allow you to get through it without getting too frustrated though. In 8th place I've gone with The Equalizer, which was published by the Powerhouse in 1986. I've already covered this in a Witchfinder's Gaming Vault video last year, so I won't go into too much detail here. This is an absolutely shameless graphical clone of Sega's Wonder Boy, blatantly ripping off the main character, enemies, landscapes and score display of that game. One difference from Wonder Boy is that it scrolls horizontally in both directions rather than just a single one. Oh, and the gameplay is massively inferior. It's a very basic run and gun style game where you must collect a few fruits on each level to move on to the next. The first 2 levels are pretty easy, but the difficulty jumps up significantly on the third due to an abundance of flying enemies that hit you as you jump over gaps. The controls are clunky, as sometimes you don't jump diagonally whereas others you do, and the game is also glitchy. You can often land in the landscape rather than on the main platform you're supposed to walk along, and sometimes enemies will spawn on top of you or just randomly disappear. It may look like Wonder Boy, which is a game I really like, but this is repetitive and soon becomes boring, having none of the nuances of the game it's cloning. It's also got a stupid, inappropriate name and music that doesn't really fit the game either. At budget price, I'm sure this snared plenty of people hoping for a cheap alternative to Activision's official release of the arcade game, but I'm also sure that most of those people would have been incredibly disappointed. I'm now moving on to games that not only rip off the graphics from more famous games, but also steal many of the gameplay ideas too, and the next game is MiG-29 Soviet Fighter, a Codemasters game from 1989. This is clearly inspired by another Sega game, Afterburner, though unusually it puts you in the role of the bad guys, in this case everyone's go-to 80s villains, the Soviet Union. It does a pretty convincing job of recreating the sprite scaling of the arcade game, with smooth movement and a reasonable 3D effect. There's also good presentation, sound and music on the title screen. The gameplay consists of simply lasting long enough to reach a refueling checkpoint, whilst gunning down as many enemies as possible. It's completely ruined though by an insanely high difficulty level right from the start. Ground-based enemies batter you and it's hard to avoid all their shots, so some will eventually get you, and your first few games of this will probably last less than 30 seconds, as you only have one life. Eventually you'll learn it's more about dodging those ground attacks than actually shooting anything, but even then you'll probably only get to level 2 at best, as the air-based enemies get more aggressive. Eventually I decided to just play the game with an infinite damage cheat on, just to show some of the later stages. You do get a choice of weapons, but nothing seems to eliminate those tanks, so the best approach I found was to equip the rockets and just take out as many air-based enemies as I could, whilst avoiding tank fire as much as possible. There are energy and weapon power-ups to collect if you last long enough, and the refueling sequence at the end of each stage is very similar to the one in Afterburner, as you'd expect. I did find the controls in this one slightly unintuitive. It would be better if up and down were reversed, allowing you to dive by pushing forwards on the joystick. And switching between weapons using the keyboard is a distraction you don't need with so many bullets flying around. The official port of Afterburner was notoriously awful on the Commodore 64, and this certainly looks and moves better than that. Unfortunately, it's just too hard to be any fun, which is a bit of a shame really, as it could have been a decent budget alternative. The next 2 games also come from Codemasters, and both featured in my Budget Publisher Showdown series, where myself and several guests talked about them at length. If you've not seen those videos and you like Commodore 64 budget titles, then please check them out. In 6th place on the list is SAS Combat Simulator, which was released by Codemasters in 1989. As if cloning one popular arcade game wasn't enough, SAS Combat Simulator went one better, or worse, by ripping off 2 80s classics. The game features slick presentation and nice graphics as your SAS operative wages a one-man war against an entire army. Each level consists of 2 stages, with the first being an overhead view run and gun affair that's obviously inspired by the likes of Commando, though the first level initially scrolls horizontally rather than vertically. The pace is a lot slower than in the Capcom game and the enemies are less abundant, but patrolling soldiers, gun emplacements and tanks will try and stop you and must be dispatched with a machine gun or grenades. All very familiar, isn't it? Once you get through the first part of each level, it will eventually switch to a side-scrolling run and stab game that is a blatant rip-off of Green Beret. The backgrounds and sprites are very similar to that game, and it even copies a distinctive military marching background tune that Konami's game had. It was an interesting idea to take influence from two different classic combat arcade games, but neither implementation does any kind of justice to the originals. The first overhead view stage is long and boring, and while later ones are shorter, they don't really add anything new other than a rather surprising car power-up. There are annoying bits where a plane flies over and kills you by somehow making contact with you, and by contrast you can also shoot over the top of buildings to hit enemies, so the perspective is all over the place. You'll soon find that it's better to keep moving than try and engage enemies, which isn't really the point of a run and gun, is it? The side-scrolling Green Beret stage is very hard as you can barely see the knife you're supposed to be using, and any contact with an enemy results in a loss of life. There's no variety to these stages either, you just plod from left to right for a seeming eternity, trying to time every stab just right, so again it is quite dull for what should be an action-packed game. You could probably argue that this wasn't the worst game for a few quid, but it's not one you'd likely play more than a few times, and with both Commando and Green Beret having really good conversions on the C64, they offered a lot more fun, even if it was at a higher price. It's that time again where I say thank you to all my channel members, whose names you can see here in my Supporters Hall of Fame. If you're enjoying this video and would like to join these fine folks and support my efforts, why not become a member yourself? For a monthly fee starting from just 99p, you can get access to the special membership perks shown on screen, and more besides. If you're interested, then please click on the join button below this video for more information. If you're not able to commit to a monthly contribution, but would still like to support my channel, then you could also give a super thanks. This one-off donation gives you a highlighted comment on whichever video you choose to click the button on, and anyone doing this will also get a shout out from me on a subsequent video. The super thanks button can be found below every video I produce. You can also help raise the profile of this channel by liking this video and leaving a comment, which helps improve my ranking in the mysterious YouTube algorithm. Any support you can give, financial or otherwise, is greatly appreciated. At number 5 I've gone with Ninja Massacre, another one released by Codemasters in 1989. We all know that ninjas were all the rage in the 80s, and as a result, so were ninja games. Codemasters oddly decided to cash in on the craze with this game that shamelessly copied Atari's popular arcade game Gauntlet, but replaced the fantasy characters of that game with ninja warriors. Essentially, the game is identical to Gauntlet, as you guide your ninja through scrolling mazes, fighting hordes of enemies that spawn from generators, collecting keys to open doors along with other items that top up health or give you magic, before finding the exit and moving on to the next stage. Just as with the home ports of the arcade game, 2 simultaneous players are supported. This is a poor relation to Atari's classic though, as it has strange semi-flick screen style scrolling, while the graphics and sound effects are quite average. All the enemy sprites have a single colour spectrumy look, though there is some better use of colour on the players and collectibles. The music and some of the sound effects are poached from another Codemasters game, Pro BMX Simulator, and there's a lack of attention to detail, evidenced by the word strength being spelled wrong on the status bar. The first stage copies Gauntlet, where you can choose to quickly exit the level or access other areas through doors that offer more pickups, but also more danger. Unlike the original arcade game though, you can't use this approach to skip levels as all the exits just go to stage 2. There is more variety in the power-ups on offer, which does help a little, and the password system is a good idea that allows you to skip earlier levels once you've completed them, but there are a lot of frustrations too. You need keys to open the treasure chests, so can easily end up wasting them and preventing yourself getting through essential doors. The enemies spawn from generators too quickly, so you can get overwhelmed and unable to destroy generators or make any progress, and many of the enemies don't really resemble ninja-like characters either. By the time you get to level 3, it's already becoming tedious as you have to blast through dozens of destructible blocks, only to then get overwhelmed by enemies. If you do manage to get through that, then there are even more enemies on later levels, and it becomes way too challenging too early. You rarely seem to pick up magic, which would be useful for clearing the screen of baddies and allowing you to move on. There are loads of Gauntlet clones on the Commodore 64, and Ninja Massacre probably isn't the worst, but the biggest problem the game would have had was that it was released at a time when the port of the arcade game was available for the same price on the Kicks label, and that's a far more appealing option than this. In 4th place is Operation Hanoi, published by Players Software in 1990. This game was programmed by Philip Ruston, and the reason I mention that name is that this isn't the last time you're going to hear it in this video. This makes no attempt to disguise the fact that it's a clone of Taito's 1987 arcade game Operation Wolf, with even the title being similar. It's almost identical graphically and very similar gameplay wise, but it's really, really hard. The graphics are good, closely mimicking the arcade game as mentioned, while the scrolling is smooth and the movement of your aiming crosshairs is fast and responsive. The sound effects are simple shooting and explosion noises, but they are effective. A slight difference from Operation Wolf is that you have to eliminate a set number of enemies per stage to progress, rather than just reaching the end of the level. You start with a very limited amount of ammo and your health bar runs out extremely quickly due to the sheer number of enemies attacking you. Ammo and health power-ups do drop from the top of the screen frequently, but they're random, so you may not get bullets often enough to replenish them. The crates also blow up before reaching the bottom of the screen, so you don't have much time to get them before they vanish. Just as in the arcade game, in addition to bullets, you do have grenades at your disposal that destroy vehicles in one hit. These are fired using the spacebar, and looking away from the screen to hit that can be fatal, so it's recommended to use a second joystick on the floor and hit the fire button with your foot to throw grenades. When your bullets run out, and they frequently will, you're limited to a single shot to try and target a power-up to replenish them, or pick off the occasional soldier, but the reality is you won't last long in this situation. In fact, you won't last long anyway, as in most games you won't clear the first stage and it'll be over in less than 2 minutes. You do get 3 lives and the quota of enemies to destroy isn't reset when you lose one, but nor is your ammo except for a few grenades. You need luck with the power-ups to have any chance of getting to the next stage. Even if you do though, your ammo is still not replenished. Operation Hanoi certainly looks the part and is programmed well, so it could have been an excellent low-cost alternative to Ocean's official port of the arcade game if it wasn't so unfairly difficult. Ruston would reuse the game engine a year later for LA Police Department, which I've reviewed in a Witchfinder's Gaming Vault video in the past. That game is marginally easier than this one, but not by much, and I wouldn't recommend that either. Coming in at number 3 is Fist Fighter, published by Zeppelin Games in 1993. This offering from Zeppelin came late in the Commodore 64's commercial life and aimed to cash in on the early 90s one-on-one fighting game boom. To be fair, it is a very good Street Fighter 2 clone in many ways. It has different characters and locations, special moves, fighter profiles, a 2-player mode and loads of options including difficulty level, number of rounds and more. It even has the post-match abuse screens that Capcom's game popularised. The large character graphics do their best to recreate the look of the era's 2D fighting games, and the backgrounds are detailed, but the limitations of the C64 hardware means everything looks very blocky, and there's lots of clash between the scenery and fighters. The sound isn't great either, with dull effects and no music in-game, and the abundance of brown on the title and status screens does the game no favours. The selection of 5 combatants is quite bizarre, ranging from the expected karate expert to a pizza delivery guy, and one that's bizarrely modelled on John Merrick, the Elephant Man. Combat is unfortunately very sluggish. You have lots of moves considering the game uses a single button joystick, but it's hard to make contact with the CPU opponent with any of them, even on the easy mode. You probably land a non-special move 1 in 10 attempts, and of course the opponent manages to land almost all of them easily. Most of the time they block everything you throw at them and then just leg sweep you until your health is gone. There's also no fluidity to the combat, as almost every move results in a knockdown which stops the action. Just like Street Fighter 2, each character has its own special move, and these can be deployed over and over by pushing down and fire. This means that if you have a projectile based attack and can keep your distance, it can make it fairly easy to get a win. If you do manage to do that, there's no progression to a more challenging opponent. The game ends and you return to the title screen. Despite my complaints, I do think this is a laudable attempt to copy a game that the C64 really could never do justice to, and it may actually be okay as a 2-player game. At budget price it would probably have been no worse than the official ports of similar arcade games, but it's no IK+, that's for sure. Second place in this list goes to Outlaw, which was released by Players in 1990. Outlaw is another game coded by Philip Ruston, and it's a pretty close clone of Capcom's Wild West run and gun Gunsmoke as far as I know. That's not a game I've played much, but this certainly has the same look and feel, with your cowboy constantly walking up the screen, dispatching bad guys until he reaches an end of level bandit, which he must kill to claim the bounty and move on to another challenge. The game features smooth scrolling and movement, while the graphics are well drawn but samey. There is an awful lot of grey and brown in use, but in this case that suits the genre, so it's no bad thing. The sound effects are nothing special, and there's no in-game music, and while the title screen music is decent enough, it's not really very appropriate for a Wild West themed game. Due to the limitations of a C64 joystick, this clone drops the 3 independent fire buttons from the arcade game. That definitely makes it a little easier, but not much, as it retains the notorious difficulty associated with Capcom games of this period. As you progress up the screen in each stage, the enemies are plentiful and can often appear on the edge of the screen and kill you when you're trying to get power-ups. Those power-up barrels and the majority of enemies need multiple hits to destroy, making fast reactions essential. You can hold down the joystick button for auto-fire, but it is possible to run out of ammo, so you need to be careful, as this makes it impossible to complete the level without sacrificing a life. If you do lose a life, you're powered down and given slower movement or shots, making progress even harder. Outlaw is definitely frustrating at times due to the cheap deaths, but once you learn where the enemies are going to spawn from, it does get a little easier. Overall, it's a good budget game and a pretty accurate clone of Gunsmoke, which is better than the official C64 port by all accounts. Finally, in first place, my favourite Commodore 64 budget clone that I discovered while producing this video is Task Force, which was released in 1989. Here's yet another game from players developed by Philip Ruston, proving both are the masters of the budget clone game. Unlike all the other games in this video, Task Force isn't a clone of an arcade game, but instead takes liberal influence from a hugely successful home computer game, Cybernoid. The setting appears to be on Earth rather than outer space, but the metallic sheen on the graphics, flick screen environment, variety of weapons and mixture of respawning and static enemies are unmistakably stolen from Hewson's 1988 classic. As I mentioned, this game is more real world based with helicopters and natural landscapes, and the graphics are very good throughout. The sound effects are decent too, and there's a good SID tune on the title and score entry screens, but no in-game music. Gameplay is a little slower and more strategic than Cybernoid, as some enemies need specific weapons to destroy them, so you have to choose the right firepower at the right time to make progress. Weapon supplies for all but the basic gun are limited, and there aren't many collectibles, so you have to be careful rather than just blasting away. Switching between weapons with the spacebar can be distracting, but it does stop you accidentally firing when you don't mean to, so it is a better alternative than using a joystick control to do so. The game is a little more accessible than Cybernoid to begin with, but is ultimately just as hard. You should be able to get a little further each time you play though, so it remains addictive. It's therefore not just a good clone, but also a very good game in its own right that would have been well worth the modest asking price. There is more though, as not content with producing one Cybernoid clone in 1989, Ruston also developed Shark, which was again released by players. This has the same metallic look as Cybernoid and also uses flick screens, but is more exploration based. The graphics, sound and music are all very good, but it has a more difficult weapon system than Task Force, as in this game pushing down changes weapons so it's quite easy to flick between them, and it's quite hard to work out what each one does. The game is also more difficult than Task Force, as even normal enemies take multiple shots with the base weapon to kill, and many seem to be indestructible. It also features gravitational devices that pull your ship towards them, which is a fairly unique idea to be fair. Shark is definitely the weaker of the two Cybernoid clones Ruston produced, but if you like the visual style of these games and enjoy a tough challenge, then it's still worth a look. That does it for this countdown of budget clones on the Commodore 64. I'd say the majority of these games were average at best, but there were a few good ones at the top end of the list. I hope you found this video interesting and discovered some games that you've never played before, although the whole point of this video was that they are in essence all games you've probably played before. If you enjoyed what you've seen, then please give this video a like and leave a comment with any thoughts you have about the games I've looked at, or even suggestions for other blatant rip-offs for the C64 released at budget price. If you'd like to support my efforts and influence the future direction of this channel, please click on the join button below the video for more information about becoming a member, with no obligation to sign up. I'll be back with more retro gaming content in the near future, so thanks very much for watching this video, and until the next time, see ya!